Okay, calm down.
Let's talk a little bit about the latest in Nordstream reporting, because this is something we talked about last time you were on, and there are constant updates. And as people know, Seymour Hersh, of course, did a piece on this that he published at Substack. Then the New York Times ran its own cover story, which was kind of laughable, as you said yourself, pretty flimsy. What's the latest? Can you summarize the kind of trajectory of stories starting from Hersh's to today?
Right. Hersh's story came after several months of media silence on the Nord Stream pipeline explosion. As soon as the explosion happened, many knowledgeable commentators who weren't scared of criticizing the United States, they were quick to point out that the United States has the largest motive in actually carrying out these attacks. And they've been saying loudly for a long time that they were against this pipeline. And, uh, and they had said almost exactly what they were going to do as soon as the war started. Newland and Biden, they both said the statements, we're going to make sure Nord Stream 2 does not go forward. And so there were lots of silence. Then Hersh's story came. And then a month later, after completely ignoring Seymour Hersh's story, you see two separate publications on the same day come out with a similar story, citing German intelligence or German investigators and U.S. intelligence that there was a yacht in Ukraine that was found by investigators that may have had something to do with this, that was rented by a Ukrainian oligarch, and it is unclear whether or not these people have any connection to the Ukrainian government. But, it's a Ukrainian oligarch, so you can make your own assumptions. Well, this piece was, picked up by a lot of people. The New York Times published it. It was darted around the Washington Post and the rest of the media ecosystem. But there were a number of problems with this piece that jumped out right away. Mainly, that it flied in the face of what investigators had initially said about the attack, was that it was sophisticated enough that it will require a state actor. So, a ragtag group of divers on a small yacht might not be the most likely culprit in a situation like that. But, journalists, they're mostly compliant, so they went along with it. They didn't ask too many questions. But at the same time, other stories were coming up too. Radio Free Europe came out with some story about a Danish tanker that was hovering around right at the same time. And then there was further reporting about some of these investigators. But now the most recent line for the New York Times is that, well, maybe this yacht was actually a decoy. Maybe that this isn't the whole story. This yacht is pretty small, and there are a lot of details that don't add up. Even just a simple matter of anchoring the yacht however deep that water was. Yeah, look at that boat. You think that boat could drop hundreds and hundreds of feet of chain anchor into the ground? Observers have pointed out that that might take up the entire space of the boat just to have that chain there. Let alone the alleged explosive residue that was found on the boat long after. If these are serious, saboteurs, you think they'd be able to cover their tracks in a way that they couldn't be found out months later. But that's the way the story went. Seymour Hersh responded to this by saying that this was, in fact, a CIA disinformation operation. Whenever you have an operation, whenever you have a clandestine covert operation, you need to have a cover story so the general public is able to go along with it. I mean, that's been the case for every covert operation in history. And this seems to be a cover story. And Seymour Hersh and his sources, they confirmed this. But one of the more interesting things that came out of Hersh's story, this was called the Ghost Ship, referring to the Andromeda, was that he talked with one of the original German reporters in Die Zeit. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. His name was Holger Stark, and Hersh considers Stark to be a good journalist, and he had a conversation with him. Stark stood by his story, claiming that they were working on the story long before the New York Times dropped it. Of course, that doesn't discount the possibility of this being a cover story. I mean, cover stories can get convoluted, as anyone who studies this sort of thing knows. But one thing that Stark did confirm, which is very interesting, was that after the explosion, if you remember the coverage, several explosions happened, but one of the mines that was laid, one of the explosives that was laid, did not go off. And Stark told Seymour Hersh that, well, Danish, Swedish, and German investigators, well, they wanted to recover the mine to figure out, what they could from that sort of thing. That's key evidence in a thing like this. Finding out the origin of the bomb, having a bomb right there. I mean, that's pretty important. So they rushed to go and pick up this unexploded mine, but they were too late. The Americans got there first. And this is according to, again, a mainstream journalist. And when asked why Stark thought the Americans got there first, he told Hersh, he said, well, Americans, they always like to be first. And then Hersh notes that, well, there is another more obvious explanation for why the Americans were so quick to rush and retrieve an unexploded mine. So you have confirmation that the Americans were some of the first people on the scene. And what this also confirms, incidentally, is that this fact was not reported to the American press beforehand. It wasn't reported anywhere beforehand. So this fact that Americans were first to the scene was suppressed until now. I mean, it might have been reported somewhere else, but I didn't hear about it, and I've been studying this fairly closely. So this fact adds a lot to the circumstantial case for U.S. complicity in the Nord Stream pipeline attacks, namely that, like I said earlier, the U.S. had long been opposed to this pipeline. They hated it. They don't want Germany to get cheap natural gas from Russia. They want to cut off Russia from its European counterparts. They want to control the flow of gas into Europe. They don't want Germany to get as industrially powerful as they could be while using this cheap Russian gas. So all those reasons give you extreme and intense geopolitical incentives for the U.S. to blow up this pipeline. But then you have the actual circumstances surrounding it. You had, according to journalist Pepe Escobar, who's a well-connected independent journalist, formerly of the Asia Times, Escobar, for his part, and using his sources, said that he confirmed the gist of Seymour Hersh's story, which is interesting in its own right. But previously, he had reported that German and Russian officials were in conversation, in secret talks on the day the pipeline exploded to maybe turn on the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, which the Russians had shut down previously as a result of a lot of the tensions going on during the war. But, Germany, they were facing the papers were using extreme language like deindustrialization, because the high cost of gas, when you can't get it from Russia, means that industry can't really function as well. It's a lot less efficient. So German industry was kind of scared. People were worried. Are German manufacturers going to start leaving the country in the next year or so? So they were desperate, and they were talking to the Russians. And while they were talking to the Russians, you have this explosion. And then Escobar also reported that while the CIA did warn Germany that someone might be coming to blow up the pipeline, the Germans were, quote, furious because they were generally kept out of the loop. The warnings were vague and unspecific and unclear. And if anything, if we're looking at this from the standpoint of a covert operation, that warning laid the groundwork for any cover story that might have come later. And so there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that points in the direction of the United States. There's no smoking gun, of course, unless you believe Seymour Hersh is an unimpeachable journalist, and no one's unimpeachable. I mean, people get things wrong, spooks lie, misrepresent, or just get things wrong on accident. But the circumstantial evidence, to any serious geopolitical observer, to anyone who doesn't have the blinders that come with being a member of the American press, For anyone like that, it's pretty clear that the United States is doing this, or that the United States was likely behind it.